In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the most common legal entities that you can use for setting up your business. I'll explain to you why you should use an entity and when you need to use one, and I'll also explain to you which entity you should use in which situation. To start with, it's important to understand that the most common reason we use separate legal entities for operating our business is to provide asset protection. We want to protect ourselves against lawsuits that could arise from customers or clients of our business or just otherwise in connection with us operating our business. And we also want to use legal entities to protect ourselves against lawsuits that arise completely outside of our business, things that aren't related to us operating our business at all. We want to protect our business and the assets that our business owns by using a legal entity. If your business is not making any money and doesn't have any assets, and if you don't really have any net worth or savings to protect, you may not need a legal entity. I've talked a lot about the different scams on YouTube of people trying to tell you how to set up an LLC and then they send you to LegalZoom or InkFile to set that up, and how in a lot of cases you may not need an LLC yet or any legal entity for your business. The second reason you could need a legal entity is that you want to make a certain type of tax election. So common tax elections are S corporation elections. A lot of business owners use S corporations to operate their business. This is not the video where we're going to cover S corporations. An S corporation is a tax election we make for our entity. So I want to make sure you understand that distinction at the outset. I have a separate video where I talk about the different tax entities that you can have. So that covers the different tax elections that you could make for your entity. So step one is what's the right legal entity, which is this video, and I will cover that. Step two would be to watch that separate video on what are the different tax elections you could make for that entity and how you should treat that entity for tax purposes. So let's go ahead and dive right into what are the most common legal entities. So I'm going to start with going over the three ones that you've probably heard of. There's five I'm going to cover in total. But some of these are not entities themselves. So for example, I'm going to start with sole proprietorship. This is what you're going to be viewed as having if you don't set up any entity. So if I just start operating a business and I don't file to set up it for, I'm sure we've all heard of LLCs or corporations. If I don't set anything up and I just start running my business, then that is going to be called a sole proprietorship if it is only owned by one person. So if you are the only owner of your business and you set up no legal entity, then you are viewed as having what we call a sole proprietorship. So again, a sole proprietorship means there's no formal entity set up. It is the default classification if you only have one owner of a business or some sort of, venture that you're doing and you don't set anything up. You're going to default into being a sole proprietorship, and it provides no asset protection. So again, if you need asset protection, then you are going to need to set up a legal entity. If you don't need asset protection and you just want to start a business and you don't have any assets, you're not worried about being sued because you don't have anything to lose, then you would start with a sole proprietorship. And then once your business is more profitable and starts to have assets and make money, or once you start to have money yourself and savings that you need to protect or investments that you need to protect, then you would shift to setting up a separate entity. So I have a big X mark here because this is generally not the case. Most of you, I'm assuming, if you're watching these videos, you've got, significant investments or savings that are worth protecting. So you're going to want to set something up. You're not going to want to go forward with just not having a legal entity. So sole proprietorship is not the way to go unless you just decide, I don't have anything worth protecting. I'm just throwing, just going to, take a shot at starting a business with very little money and very little capital, then maybe that's for you. But again, I'm assuming we've got some assets we want to protect. So this is not going to be the way to go. You also can't make any tax elections like the S Corp or C Corp election with the sole proprietorship because you don't have anything that you are electing for. So you need a legal entity itself to make those tax elections. The next one I'm going to talk about is the limited liability company or LLC. This one is the most common. I'm sure you've probably heard of it before. In the vast majority of cases, this is going to be the right entity for you. You can make and treat LLCs different ways. So setting up an LLC doesn't mean you can't have an S Corp or C Corp. You can make those tax elections as I cover in my other video on tax elections and the different tax entities you can have. But we typically like to set up LLCs because it provides a lot of flexibility. An LLC can have one owner or it can have multiple owners. So if I have a business that I'm starting myself, I'm the only owner, chances are good I'm almost always going to want to set up an LLC. The same is true if you have multiple owners. You want to try to use an LLC in most cases, and I'll talk to you more about why that's the preferred entity as opposed to the different types of partnerships, which I'll talk more about. LLCs are easy to maintain. That doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything or do any kind of admin. There are requirements every year. I have a number of videos about how to maintain your LLC and the different formalities that you have to follow. You can't just kind of set it up and be done with it. There are requirements and things that you'll need to do on an annual basis and different things that you need to satisfy when you set it up. So you will need to work with a lawyer to do that. And I have a lot of videos where I tell you about like how to set it up, what type of documents you need, and how to maintain it. So make sure you check those out, because you're not going to get the asset protection benefits if you don't set this up right and maintain your LLC properly. As I mentioned, this is the most common entity. I've never had, outside of the context where I'm going to tell you about when you should use a corporation, I've really never seen a situation when I used to do consulting for clients where they used an entity other than an LLC and it actually made sense. If you set up the LLC right, this is probably the best entity for you because it is going to be the easiest to maintain. With the caveat that there are going to be situations where you use other entities, which I'll talk about in the next slide when we get to corporations. So general partnership, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is another default classification. You'll see the big X because I cannot imagine a situation where you would ever really want to use this type of company unless you are in a situation I mentioned where you just don't have any money, your business has nothing, you're starting from scratch with very little capital to put in, you don't have anything to protect, you don't have any money to pay an attorney to set up an entity, and you've got a co-owner with you, then you're going to default into a general partnership if you have more than one owner. So whereas if you're a single owner and you don't set up a legal entity, you'll default to a sole proprietorship. If you have more than one owner and you don't set up a legal entity, you're going to default to a general partnership. So general partnerships are bad because they provide no asset protection in the sense that every owner of that partnership is personally liable. You have unlimited liability because you're all what you call general partners. General partners in a partnership have unlimited liability. And what that means is that if the partnership has debt, you're on the hook for the entire amount of that debt. If the partnership has a lawsuit, you're on the hook for the entire amount of that lawsuit judgment. Each partner themselves is individually liable. So if I set up a business with somebody else who doesn't have any money, but I do have money, then I still have to pay that lawsuit and pay that debt off from my own personal assets. So they can come after me. They can come after anything I own as a general partner. So you typically don't want to ever be a general partner in a partnership. So general partnerships are bad. Again, it's the default if you don't set anything up. So if you are going to set up an entity and be treated as a partnership, that's typically going to be what we call limited partnership. So if you've got a general partnership, that means you didn't set up a legal entity. If you set up a legal entity and it's a partnership, it's going to typically be what we call a limited partnership. So a limited partnership has both limited partners and it has general partners. You have to have at least one general partner. So remember, you don't want to be that general partner because that general partner has unlimited liability. They don't get the same asset protection benefits that the limited partners have because they have unlimited liability. So you do not ever want to be a general partner of a limited partnership or any type of partnership. So remember that. If you're a limited partner in a limited partnership, you are only liable up to the amount you invested. So limited partnerships are quite common when we think about investment funds. So if you're invested in a real estate fund or syndication, you are commonly a limited partner in a partnership. So let's say I invest $100,000 in that fund. If that fund goes belly up and, loses all its money, I only lose my $100,000. It doesn't matter if there's a lawsuit from a tenant that used our property, or like, let's say it owns an apartment building and somebody gets hurt and sues the apartment building, I can only lose my investment. So if there's still money to be paid or owed on debt that partnership has, they can't come after me above my $100,000 investment. So I put my $100,000 in as a limited partner. Yes, I can lose that amount, but that's all I can lose. So you are protected to any extent above the amount of your investment. So if you are going to be in a partnership, you want to be a limited partner. Again, the context where I see these very commonly is with funds. So private equity funds, hedge funds, real estate funds, venture capital funds. These are almost always going to operate with partnership structures. You typically do not want to do this for a business. So I have seen people use partnerships for businesses because they want to do special allocations and get kind of fancy with how they allocate deductions to one partner versus another. You don't want to do that because you're going to have an asset protection issue. So you want to try to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish some other way, but you do not want to set up a partnership. I've never had someone come to me in practice where they were operating a business, not like an investment fund, where they were operating a business and they were using a partnership that it made sense. So again, you typically do not want partnerships because they're going to have at least one general partner. When you invest through a fund or syndication like an investment fund, the fund manager is the general partner. They've got separate structures on their end to limit their liability. Commonly, you'll have an LLC be the ultimate owner of the general partner, be the general partner in the partnership. So they're limiting their liability in other ways by structures above what you see. But you do not want to be the general partner. The fund manager, the sponsor, the person setting up the deal and managing the deal, they're going to be the general partner. So keep in mind, you never want a situation where you're a general partner in a partnership. So I put a caution sign because, again, I'm speaking to you as how you should set up your legal entity for your business. And it's very rare that you're going to want to ever use a limited partnership, for a business itself that's an operating business. The last entity I want to talk to you about is called a corporation or an Inc., or Inc. is short for incorporated. So corporations are typically used for very, very big companies. So they can't make certain tax elections. So if you understand the difference in a flow through and a non-flow through structure for tax purposes, which I cover in my other video, then you should understand that a corporation, if you set up a corporate entity, you may not be able to make certain tax elections and you may not be able to treat that entity, as you want it from a tax standpoint. So there is some lack of flexibility there in some cases. Also, it's the most expensive to maintain. So there's additional hurdles that you have to go through to maintain that entity that are above what you would have to for an LLC. And that is why we typically don't like these entities. They're, commonly subject to bad tax treatment, as I mentioned. And we typically limit corporations to very large companies. So if you're wanting to IPO your company, that company is going to ultimately have to be a corporation. Usually, there are some master limited partnerships, but for business purposes, typically you're going to have a corporation in order to do an IPO. If you want to be if you're thinking this thing's going to be worth 500 million or more, even if you aren't thinking you'll take it public, you probably want a corporation at some point. There can be some issues with being able to get, debt in some cases if you're a very large company and you don't have a corporation. And again, if you're ever wanting to have the flexibility to take the company public, it's going to probably need to be an incorporated at some point. So again, another caution sign here, because I see people set these up for their small to mid-sized businesses in some cases, and that doesn't really make sense. It does provide you asset protection, but you don't need that. You should be able to accomplish it with an LLC, which is much cheaper and easier to maintain. If you use and operate your LLC and set it up properly, you're typically not going to want this. And it's typically potentially going to have some lack of flexibility as far as some tax planning that we do there. So these are the 5 most common entities for operating a business. Some of these I just mentioned because you'll never see. You should never see someone with a general partnership. You should never see someone with a limited partnership for a small to mid-sized business usually. But I want to cover these because I do see these come up, and there are some misconceptions where people use these and it's not the right structure. Also, there are, of course, other types of entities out there. There's different types of trusts, for example, but that's beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover here. When you're operating a business, you are typically going to think about these 5 structures, or commonly, the ones that are in consideration, and you're almost always going to want to be the limited liability company, as I mentioned before. So hopefully you found this video helpful. I highly encourage you to now watch the tax entity video where I covered the different tax entities you can have and what the different advantages and disadvantages are for each of those entities.